A very good morning. I think we are now live. So I want to welcome everybody to the debate and discussion that we're going to be having this morning on the launch of the Policies of Belonging report, the latest report from Onwards Repairing Our Social Fabric programme. My name is James O'Shaughnessy. I am the chair of the report, and I am joined by two fantastic speakers today. And welcome to John and to Danny and to all of you who have joined us for our discussion. As I mentioned, the purpose of the event is to launch the report. It was officially published last week, and what it is a policy playbook that sets out bold and ambitious prescriptions to give citizens and communities the power and resources to shape their lives. And it builds on the year-long work that the Repairing Our Social Fabric programme has done. As I said, we are going to hear from two speakers before we go to Q&A. The first of those is Danny Kruger, MP for Devizes. Danny is a social entrepreneur. Among other things, he set up the West London Children's Zone and Only Connect. He is one of the Conservative Party's great thinkers, and his report, Levelling Up Our Communities, got a very warm welcome from the Prime Minister. And it contains such bold recommendations such as a Community Power Act to put public services in the hands of communities, and a £2 million endowment fund for community transformation financed out of dormant insurance accounts. We'll then be hearing from John Quillis, MP for Dagenham and Rainham. John is a part of the Labour Together movement, helping the Labour Party reconnect with local communities. He is also a social entrepreneur, deeply involved in community action on the ground, in concert often with Barking and Dagenham Council in his patch, and is one of the leading intellectuals in the Labour Party. And very personally, John and Danny took part in a debate on social fabric and social capital issues that took place last Monday. And I will try and post a link to that in the chat so that you can see what that was about. Really, really worth watching, not least actually from the positive response from the government minister to the ideas which were generated and put forward in that debate. So, about the report, what is it that we have recommended in this paper? So, a little bit of history for those who aren't familiar with it. This programme, Repairing Our Social Fabric, has its roots in a paper called The Politics of Belonging, which was published over a year ago, which found that security, not freedom, was now the abiding concern of most people in the UK. And the feeling within that community was in decline and that people wanted to see that corrected. And that really helped spawn the Repairing Our Social Fabric programme. Since the launch, we launched in early March last year. Obviously, the pandemic hit, and that has really shone a spotlight on some of the structural weaknesses and also the strengths in our communities. The public response, as we know, has been magnificent, an upswell in volunteering and neighbourliness, but of course it's also put tremendous pressure and grown inequalities that already existed. Strong communities have fared better than those with weaker social fabric, and that creates problems that we want to address. We also launched in September our Social Fabric Index, the first time we believe that anyone has tried to map comprehensively the social fabric of our communities across the entirety of the UK. And that found three big trends that we have continued to explore. The first is, as I mentioned, that overall decline in community strength. The second is the widening gap. And the third, which has been accentuated by the pandemic, is a growing gap between younger and older people. Older people actually becoming more trusting, connected with their communities during the pandemic, younger people less so. And that's on top of all the other intergenerational issues that we're aware of, asset distribution, climate change, and others. So that really took us to the policies of belonging. What do we do about these changes? The way we tried to think about it was in so 2x2 grid, how we can both give power and resources to individuals and communities to change and strengthen their local communities. Some of the big ideas in that involved giving every local area the right to self-government through a parish or town council, replacing the marriage tax allowance with a family tax allowance would allow partners to transfer allowance to working spouses, empowering communities to secure land for community-led housing to make sure there's local housing for local people, introducing a year to serve civic scheme to give unemployed young people a paid placement with local charities and social businesses, and finally giving workers the ability to draw down a year of their pension early to take a civic sabbatical. These are some of the big and provocative ideas that we put forward, along with many others, and we're looking forward to hearing your responses to those today. Just finally, in terms of format, As I mentioned, Danny will speak, then John, then we'll have a bit of a discussion and a Q&A. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom. We'll come to your questions before we get to the end, and I will try to take as many of those as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you to give us your perspective on social fabric and how we repair it.
Great. Thanks, James. And hello, everybody. Very good to be on this. This is part of what I think of as a great sort of gentle revolution that's blowing through our political culture, and one hopes finally through our policy and real life in due course. I mean, it is in fact reflecting a lot of the way we actually live and think. And I pay tribute to Onward's work, both the policy work like today's, but also their analysis of public opinion and their identification of the sort of tribes that make up Britain. And what I think we're doing here, and what I think this report reflects, is not just the clever ideas of James and his colleagues, but a real sort of echoing back, a reflecting back to the public about what they're actually asking for and what they've always wanted. Because this is the agenda here is a reaction to a very long trend that's particularly acute in our century, over the last 20 years. We can also trace it back a lot further. In the report I did last year, I talked about a 40-year doctrine, dogma of economic mobility, the idea of labour and capital just being able to find each other in the free market, which doesn't really happen, or doesn't happen to the benefit of people in the deindustrialised towns as it was supposed to. And we can trace these trends back to the way, that economic dislocation, the growth of technology that makes home life very different. We've sort of domesticated our lives to a great degree, not living in the communal way that we did before. Different ways of living and shopping and working. But it has all intensified in this century, and I attribute that partly just to the intensification of globalization and sort of marketization under the Blair government, but also what they did with public services, of course, was just continuing intensifying work that had started under John Major and before. But the doctrine of new public management, the way we centralize public services while also outsourcing them and individualizing them, making everything about a sort of quasi-market transaction between purchasers and providers with unit costs, and treating the public as if they were customers of a service, has some great benefits, which are probably obvious, but has some great demerits as well, not least in the disempowerment that it produces for the communities these services are there for. And so the combination of these trends of globalization, of new public management and the public services, sort of Blairism, and of course our continuing kind of cultural disarray and postmodernism and cultural relativism and our refusal to say anything definite about who we are, has produced this, what I think of as a ultimately disenchanted society where we've lost all sense of meaning. And Chesterton talked about disenchantment, and the sense that we've taken the magic out of life, and that's because we've taken the relationships out of life. So we've kind of completed Marx's alienation. We've achieved Chesterton's disenchantment. We're steadily demoralised, and then we've managed to exacerbate all of these problems with a global pandemic, which has massively widened inequality and isolation, alienation, and so on. But also, there lives the deepest, freshest, deep down thing, as General Manley Hopkins said, and that is apparent in the growth and the new growth in community spirit that we're seeing now and that we have seen over the last year. And so the life under the pandemic points the way to what we want. And this paper identifies a lot of the policy levers I think should be pulled. So it's around localism. It's about deliberately decentralizing undoing the power grab of the last generations, not just through what I think we do need, which is a deliberate kind of chunking down. We've chunked down from Brussels to London, which is very positive and welcome. We now need to chunk down further to cities, counties, towns, local government, but a bit more also informal decentralisation and empowerment of communities through public service reform and so on. That's where I am very much in support of everything that the report proposes. We could go very keen to go into more detail on any of it. Just lastly, just say a word on the politics. I'm really delighted that Onward have gripped this. I am pleased as a Conservative Party politician that people on my side of the debate are waving the flag for this sort of reform. But let's acknowledge also, and John Cruddas, who I've admired for years, is a pioneer here. He has colleagues on the Labour side who have been talking in these terms for a long time as well. And while I don't think there is a sort of cosy consensus, or it wouldn't be helpful to achieve a cosy consensus, and in fact, I think that our politics should be fight over this common ground. We should be fighting for the possession of it, because that battle is what enfranchises the public and moves us forward. Nevertheless, it is a great thing that we are in broad agreement about the sorts of changes that are needed. And I hope we can work together across the aisle to further this agenda in both countries. Thanks, James.
Danny, thank you. Lots there to pick up on. I might come back to some of the points that you made when I come to questions. I'm glad you gave us some uplift at the end. It was starting to look gloomy, as gloomy as the clouds that are gathering above me now. But as you say, I think there is hope amid the darkness. On, over to you.
Thank you very much, James. It's great to be here. I really welcome the policies belonging document, and actually the broader work programme of repairing the social fabric that Onward have been excavating for nigh on a year now, and also the partners that include Joseph Rowntree, Power to Change, Shelter and the like. I think they've done a fantastic job. They've literally built a new metric to analyse each community in the country, which is a great resource for politicians and policymakers. But beyond that, I think they're beginning to really create a space beyond the sort of sterile state or market territory that has dominated politics for so long. And I'm really keen on that, because obviously the pandemic has detonated this sort of space and exposed the limitations of such a dialogue. I really hope that we can have a cross-party dialogue stroke disagreement about this, because for too long it's been vacant, as politicians tend to group around competing economic visions of the world, and which offers diminishing returns when the more we know is that people and communities are desperate for a proper dialogue about how they can return power to themselves, their families, their communities, and feel they have more control over it. They literally want to take back control, as we've heard so readily over the last few years. I was on a Essex rodeo show that I do for an hour every week yesterday. And what was struck me in the context of the vaccination and people really desperate to volunteer and help in the rollout was also how it related to their sense of frustration around politics. And literally at the end, the last caller was almost shouting at me to get on and talk to the opposition and not just play games because the stakes are too big. And I think that is so true in terms of what we know is happening on the ground and what we've all had to live through. I would hope that we can create some dialogue over the next year of this programme with Labour. The platform I'm involved in, called Labour Together, is just about to launch a new power and democracy report with Steve Reed, the shadow local government minister, and Steve will be very up for a conversation around this. I would say I really like the policy rollout that's been developed. There's 17 policies on this 2x2 matrix of empowering individuals and communities and financing individual communities. I think that's a really effective sort of program of work there that I very much support, not least because it very much goes with the grain of my experiences of what's working, what isn't in Dagenham. I'm writing a book, a biography of Dagenham, because it's this centenary year today, 2021. And if you go back to the whole history of the community, you see all sorts of different, often pioneering attempts to rebuild community, literally create a community initially of over 100,000 people and 20,000 properties. Often it ended up with quite a paternalistic form of statecraft as a method of nurturing communities. But just over the last few years, we've been trying to do something very different and move to a more participatory model, less paternalistic, and with quite a bit of success, actually. This was before the pandemic struck. And we managed to use that to build 9 community hubs locally to align with civic government, the faith communities, and the voluntary and charitable sector. And it's been pretty effective. Our challenge is how we take that further, and also what that means for government in helping to rebuild that sense of civic pride and citizenship at the local level. And that's why I really like the specific policy proposals about endowing power and finance into communities, because they go with what we're trying to test drive locally. I'd like to think that over the next year, Onward might think about how they can work with specifically a few local communities around the country to sort of test some of the ideas on the ground. But just in conclusion, James, I really do welcome this. I think it does suggest a different type of politics. It has loads of different challenges for the political class because it's usually about state capture, so to deliver things. And this is sort of slightly countercultural in terms of getting power to give it away and build more challenging communities. And it also has a new currency to politics, less about economics and utility, more about solidarity and fraternity, because that's where I think the future politics, that's the terrain of the future political conversation across both of our political traditions on the left and right. So in conclusion, I think it's a fantastic report. I haven't got into any of the details of the policies, maybe that can come out in conversation, but I think all power to your elbow, because I think it's a fantastic piece of work. And the more we can have quite a challenging dialogue across our political traditions, the better for the country and politics actually as well.
Thank you for that and for the warm praise. I mean, I should also mention that John and Danny are on the steering group for the programme, along with our fantastic sponsors, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Shelter and Power to Change, and every one of those has made a contribution to the work that we have done. There are, I think, a couple of points which come out from what both of you have said. I think the first is that, you put it, Danny, this agenda is a response to a public desire for a politics that goes beyond economics. And for some reason, in the last 100 years, we have got absorbed into a limited version of politics, which seems to be only defined by economic incentives and motivations. And clearly that is a poor description of what it means to live a good life. It's important, it's a component, but it's not the be all and end all. And one of the consequences of that, or I think, is what you pulled out, John, which is, over that time we've also moved to a more centralised, just-in-time approach, if you like, to society as well as to economics, and that's very efficient but very unresilient, as we have discovered over the last year. So there seem to be good reasons why, structural reasons as well as current reasons, why this kind of politics and these kind of ideas might appeal. And certainly if you opinion poll them, they seem to be pretty favourable one way or another. But I think we also do have to ask ourselves a couple of difficult questions. And the first is, if this sort of politics appeals to people, why has it been on such a poor losing run for the last 100 years, as Danny said? I would be really interested in both your reflections on why that's the case and what needs to be overcome to make it, give it a chance of success. And the second flows from something that you said, John, which is the kind of paternalism versus participatory. I think none of us want to go back to a paternalist approach, but there is an association of these ideas with a kind of top-down paternalism, do-goodery, as you might have been called once upon a time. Whereas, of course, what we're really talking about here is giving people power and control over their lives. How do we avoid falling into the paternalist trap? And do people really want to make the time for this kind of engagement in their lives, in their busy lives with all sorts of pressures? Is there really that kind of deep-seated desire for democratic engagement that we believe and hope and have seen in action, but in terms of a widespread participation across society? So, Danny, I might come to you first, as give John a rest after he just spoke. But Danny, you might give your reflections on both those questions.
Yeah, I think the reason this paradigm is not dominant is because, with a number of reasons. One is that just the numbers don't work for it. The numbers don't add up. They're not very big numbers for a start, and we all like playing with big numbers. So the big contracts, the big tax and spend decisions, and actually we're talking here about the sort of, as it were, the small stones that go in the bucket, not the big rocks, and they're harder to work with, and there's an evidence problem. There's a great paper coming out, it's been looking at an early draft of it by New Local, talking about what they call the evidence paradox, the fact that we just don't count the stuff that matters. And of course, we're familiar with this in the way the Treasury makes its decisions, but it cuts across the whole of public and private sector decision making. That the sort of things that we really value in life don't fit into any of the matrices, the metrics and the indices that we need. So it's a problem around measurement and the numbers. And the other perhaps more profound problem is us. I mentioned Chesterton, he was asked what's the problem with modern society or whatever, and he wrote, "Dear Sir, I am yours sincerely, G.K. Chesterton." We are the problem. We don't want to make the effort, and we respond to a retail politics and to a retail consumer culture, which gives us what we think we want, not do the hard graft of building community, which was only built historically because it had to be. It's the only way. We're no better or worse than previous generations. We've just got mod cons. And so we need to create a culture and a structure and a model that it makes it a little bit easier for us as pretty lazy people to make an effort. And technology now is doing that. I've just been involved in the last couple of weeks trying to get volunteer drivers in for vaccination programs, which has done incredibly well. People really want to step up and help. It's enormously enabled by the internet. And by making it easy to book in and everything. So I think we can make life easier for people, and that's frankly what we need to do to make this agenda live.
Well,
thanks, John.
There's so much in your question, James. I would, there are so many quite profound questions that you've pulled out. I would say, actually, there is an issue of political philosophy in this, in that there's sort of three traditions of political philosophy. The third one, namely that concerned with issues of fraternity and virtue, rather than questions of liberty and freedom or utility and welfare, that's disappeared. It's almost been exiled from the political conversation. And part of the task here is to change the terms of political debate by reintroducing historic traditions which have been marginalised in the political debate. Now that sounds a very abstract conversation, but it translates into a form of politics as a practice which is centralising, deeply utilitarian and statist. And that is because certain of those traditions of political philosophy have dominated, and they've trained generations of public administrators and politicians, which means that we lack the resources to change the terms of politics, even though we know that people operate outside of those strict confines of economic calculus, and they want and desire a different life and a different world for their families and communities. And that is vividly exposed in this pandemic, actually, in terms of what people confronting death. We reconsider the importance we attach to things beyond monetary value, and that gets right to the core of what Danny was saying. Now, it's also much more difficult to build and nurture communities and give power away than it is to accrue it and operate within the usual confines of public administration. That is the deeply revolutionary element to this agenda, by the way. I was reminded, going back to this Dagenham story, which I'm sort of is all consuming for me at the moment as I'm writing this, there was this fantastic quote of a report about the creation of Dagenham in 1934 saying, if it had been built in America, it would have been the hallmark of the New Deal. If it had been built in Russia, it would have dominated the current 5-year plan. But because it was built and done in England, no one really noticed the capacity of Britain to do things if it has the political will to do it. And the building of the estate Dagenham is an extraordinary moment in British history, coming out following the armistice, the First World War, an extraordinary story that led up to the creation of the Second World War and the creating homes for heroes, slum clearance and the like. So we have in our history the resources to rethink communities. We've just sort of almost exiled our capacity to do it in our politics, and that needs to change and be unpacked. That sounds like quite an abstract conversation, but it leads to a different sort of mindset amongst our politicians and administrators and think tanks if we go down this road, which I think we're beginning to, because it's awash with possibilities. It's very challenging because there's a lot of wreckage in the road of discarded reports which have tried to create and nurture this space, but then it's been put in the too difficult box by politicians, and that is the challenge to the government today. Is their levelling up agenda just about economics, job generation plans, a bit of regeneration budgets, or is it about a genuine empowerment? And the jury's out there. We shall see. I hope it's the latter, and the more we can do to sort of push both the government and the political parties and their leaders in this direction, the better it will be.
Yeah, no, thanks, John. And I think Danny and I bear some of the scars of that process and big society and so on, well-meaning endeavours and sincerely meant, but didn't quite achieve in a systematic way what we hoped they would. So I think we are very conscious of that. I think, for what it's worth, I do think there is an understanding that levelling up must mean more than economics, although of course it means economics too. The question, as you say, is how, and how do you measure it and demonstrate as a political party that wants to get elected or re-elected, that you've made a difference, and part of that is in the inevitable nature of retail politics, and I think that's why the policy element as well as the kind of theoretical elements of this really matters, and having ideas which resonate with people. Look, we're getting lots of questions and comment on the chat, so I think I'm going to try and switch straight over and take some of these. What I do to try and keep to my own discipline, everyone who's put stuff on the chat is actually a question. Could you put it on, repost it on the Q&A function, and then I won't be flitting between the two. Do keep using the chat to exchange views and stuff. That's great, and there's good stuff on there. If you want to actually ask a specific question, please can you put it on to the Q&A. So taking them in order, I'm going to take a couple at a time. The first is from Lynn Bowers, who says, great, thank you, Lynn. How do we build the obvious cross-party consensus? There are other parties, political parties too, that would readily align. Well, Danny and John have touched on that a bit. Do we want a consensus, or do we actually want an argument about who's going to do it best? What does success look like, particularly in let's face it, a politically divided time, when we also know that one of the things that puts people off politics is politicians arguing with each other needlessly. And the second is from Justin Griggs, who has said that the NALC has warmly welcomed this report. Thank you, Justin. In particular around parish and town councils. How do we think that we can make that happen? So, Danny, maybe I could come to you first to answer those couple of questions, and then John, and then we'll move on to the next. You're muted, Danny. Sorry.
As I say, I don't think we want to achieve a cozy consensus. We need to argue this out. But all parties that I can think of have this in as part of their tradition. It's just been the sort of sub-theme rather than the dominant one. I mean, to me, this is conservatism, but I recognise other parties claim it too. Obviously, there's a strong mutualist strand in Labour, which John represents. Beveridge, for all we associate him with the welfare state, was a liberal politician and a great communitarian. Even the SNP have their origins. Scottish nationalism had its origins, or part of its origins at least, in the desire for a more local, connected society. It's a shame that the modern version is so statist, but I think there are people in all parties who share a lot of these views. The question, I guess, is who's prepared to really follow through and challenge the orthodoxy, and that's what we need. The second question about parish and town councils. Thanks, Justin. I mean, as you know, I'm very much supportive of this agenda. I think we've seen something brilliant in parish councils. I mean, I represent a rural constituency in Wiltshire where it's a unitary council and then lots of little parishes, and they have, done a very patchy job. I was about to say they're all amazing. Of course, they're not. Lots of them have done absolutely nothing, but that's because they want to, and in a sense, that's their democratic will. But I think we can see a great renaissance in parish councils. I just think we need to have a political culture that gets local people to step up stand for council and support potentially the use of the precept to do stuff, rather than just think the job of parish councillors is to keep the precept down and to do, frankly, keep things as they are in places like mine, then I think we can achieve change. It's probably much about the kind of overall political culture as well as any kind of systematic changes to where power resides. I'm all for putting power as locally as possible, but really we need communities to sort of call for it as much as politicians to push it.
Thanks, Danny. And I guess, John, these things do look different in London, right? There's been
they do.
There's one, or indeed in other big cities. I think there's one new community council created in London in Queen's Park in the sort of last 50 years or something, and yet the need is just as great. Or maybe there are different vehicles. Maybe that's the wrong vehicle. What do you think?
Well, we created. We're a relatively small London borough. We created 9 community hubs within a borough of 200,000 people, right, given the pandemic, and that worked quite well. It's just a sort of 2-ward level sort of arrangement, and we're thinking about how we can build panels and new architecture around that to try and carry on this process of trying to give the power away to these local sort of hubs of faith-based charity voluntary sectors aligned with the council. And it is quite challenging. It's challenging for the town hall more than anything, in terms of the culture around it, not least in a community with a history of Dagenham, which is heavily municipalist in a specific type of way. But things are changing. We have fantastic new redesign of council services. We have new youth facilities, new participatory projects. I'm very optimistic about the direction of travel locally. Going back to the question around how it relates to a sort of cross-party dialogue, I agree. There's the danger is we blur all the edges to this, and it just becomes some sort of soft language that people align. I think we need to have a much more, we need to have a tougher conversation about where we disagree actually as well. And that might well be around the question of local government. That will be one, I think, and there'll also be questions of public funding, but I think we can come to all that. The question is how we can use this year to try and create space. James mentioned in the, his introduction, we had a small debate last week, but it was just a sort of a toe in the water, as it were. And even then, people were quite surprised that in one of these debates, we just had half of the time for Danny and myself, and the minister responded. And the actual tenor of the conversation, it was a conversation rather than a row about, the usual sort of bun fight across the political aisles. So it's possible. The question of, and we decided to try and use the first day of the parliamentary session this year to see if we could start things in the manner we want to carry on. So the idea would be to have a succession of debates and use some of these onward materials and some of the materials from other different parties to sort of infill that sort of space over the next months ahead, and invite all the political parties, different political traditions, different think tanks to help and try and use that space and sort of nurture it through the year, and then put some more pressure on the different formal party policy-making procedures, manifestos over the next couple of years, and see if we can make a dent in terms of the effectiveness of these sort of contributions. And I think we can. I'm very optimistic about it.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think actually, what better in a way to use that parliamentary space to do than to have it and to have those debates on the record and with meaning. So I think that's incredibly welcome initiative. So a couple more questions now from Richard Hamilton, who's asked about the importance of physical environment. I guess this is something about pride in your community. Interestingly, if you look at our research, we didn't find a close correlation between physical infrastructure and social fabric. It's not to say it doesn't matter, but the two are not synonymous. And the conclusion we drew from that is that you can't regenerate a community by filling the potholes, to put it bluntly. It takes a lot more to that, but it doesn't mean it doesn't matter. And so, having that distinctiveness and identity locally and the physical environment is at the heart of what Richard's asked. And then Paul Maynard, which I assume is MP, Paul Maynard, hello Paul, has also asked about civic leadership, how to create the civic leadership that can actually do the bottom-up job that we want to see. It was certainly something we talked about in the report. Yeah. I think, we haven't really solved that problem, if I'm honest, or come up with a good solution. So it'd be good to hear both of you about that. John, if I could come to you first, then Danny.
Yeah, I think they're two very good questions. How do you do this? I tell you where I go to. Dagenham in the post-war period, through what is now known as the Young Foundation, which is called the Institute of Community Studies of Bethnal Green, set up by Michael Young when he left the Labour Party Research Department in 1950. They extolled the virtues of Dagenham as the stable, extended working class family that had settled patterns of life, and it was seen to herald a certain form of stability, fraternity, and durability amongst an empowered working class with greater consumer power, etc., etc. But within a generation that disintegrated, and what the most stable community in the country became the fastest changing community in the country, and we were then on the front line with 12 BNP councillors. So there is a danger in assuming what works here, and this is quite a sort of combustible terrain in terms of it's not just about a pride in place, because that can turn in on itself very, very quickly, and it can unleash forms of rage and anger as well. So this is really tricky space in terms of how you nurture it. We're trying to use the actual centenary after having defeated the far right and extremism, and now having a very settled political community, to re-establish the historic ownership of the traditions within the community as part of trying to rebuild a sense of modern citizenship, which is difficult given the fact it's the cheapest housing community in London, so it's the fastest changing. And some of the questions in the private rented sector mean the rate of change means it's very difficult to establish citizenship and a sense of community. Even in streets where people are changing literally all the time. And how do you do that? And we have welcome committees, welcome packs in every street that we're trying to develop to try and build that from the outset of people moving in, welcoming neighbour planning things. I do think the second question is very important though. How do you nurture, incubate new forms of civic leadership that understand this? We're very lucky in Dagenham because Darren Wadwell, our community leader, I first met him when he was organising a community funder and he wasn't involved in any political party whatsoever. 15 years on, he's leading the council now because he comes out of the community space rather than the normal sort of tributaries to becoming an elected politician, if you want. And so he's very different, and he's forming a sort of political leadership, civic leadership in his own mold, which is very useful. I mean, in the report, there is proposals to endow new forms of civic leadership programs and the like, which I think we need to be built on, because I think that is a silver bullet in all of this. Because usually civic leadership is seen as a stepping stone to parliamentary representation and then trading up in the Westminster game. And you see, it all leads to this sort of quite a centrifugal focus on your parliamentary or political ambitions, rather than civic leadership itself being a virtuous role that we should be building around. So that is a real difficult one that we shouldn't neglect in the future conversations, actually.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and I think that, as you say, that it does get a mention as a priority in the report. But we need we're intending to do more work on how to turn it into a practical step. And Cassie Robinson has asked about practical steps, and I think that is definitely one of them. Danny, your thoughts on those questions?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I mean, I think that echo everything John said. I mean, I represent a very settled community in Wiltshire. 4,000 years old, not 100 years old, as I said in that debate the other day, John. But I mean, it's not all Neolithic anymore, but modern days, I assure you. But I worked for years before this job to try to support the community in West London, the White City estate, which is similar, one of these wonderful kind of interwar estates with a lot of heritage and history, but now has a very transient population. The last 50 years, we just had this. It just is reflected what's been going on in the world in terms of kind of global migration shifts, and yet there are people there. Some of them old timers, some of them new arrivals, who want to step up. But I just think we need to be quite blunt about this. And Paul asked the question. I know Paul's an MP for Blackpool, where again you've got pockets which are highly transient. Some very, very troubled bits of Blackpool. And what they've done there, I hope he'd endorse the efforts that have been made, because I know he's been involved in them, quite simply, there's a whole bunch of really brilliant people from outside Blackpool who've come in and formed a partnership there to bring in investment and to try and change national policy to create the sort of environment that Blackpool needs, that will then nurture the local capabilities. And so we can't just be totally romantic about this and imagine that everywhere is going to be, local leaders are going to spring up naturally. We need to be a bit directive. And I think identifying, putting kind of policy barriers around a place and saying this is a zone where we're going to do some interesting stuff and how allow experimentation, like you recommend in the report, James. I think that can both bring in expertise from outside, because there's something interesting that we could do in this place, and it'll give the place itself a sense of uniqueness and opportunity. So
yeah, and I think that, as you say, there's some of the ideas within it. The idea is that they layer on each other. So local civic control, charitable giving zones, and so on. So that actually you focus this in. And of course, the last Labour government did have various schemes to do this, and I think with moderate success, largely on the economic rather than sort of social side. And of course, what we're trying to do is provide a way of understanding how to regenerate an entire community, not simply just to move jobs from one place to another. And hopefully we can we would achieve some of that through those ideas. So just moving on, Richard Alford, who's a supporter of Onward and the project. So thank you, Richard, has talked about delight at the focus on small stones, but is that at odds with the rhetoric about levelling up north-south? Do we conceive of these things in the wrong way? Because we talk about north-south or the four nations rather than this much more granular approach, because of course there is huge variety even if you just travel a few miles. Tom has asked about really good question about community land trusts actually, and frankly, are we going far enough? Do we need more rights? Maybe rights is the wrong word, but anyway, an entitlement to take over, not just to ask permission. We need to be more radical, and actually there is the government's just announced a plan to consult on a reformed right to regenerate. The Scottish have been mentioned by Danny, and as actually being much more proactive in this area. It runs up against, in the Conservative Party anyway, instincts about property ownership and property rights and so on. But what does it mean to own something? Is it just a financial transaction, or is it something more emotional? So and Cassie has brought us right down to the practical. Great, good ideas, but what are I guess, to put it differently, what are the first steps that we should be taking to actually make this kind of change? John.
Again, there's a lot there. I mean, the variety point, sure, but what I like about this, what I like actually is the contrast between Dagenham and Devizes, is that it showcases modern politics is driven by binaries between, young, old, leave, remain, urban, rural, and it's almost as if, and you see the growing polarization of it. And can you create a new dialogue that sort of transcends that and focusing in on things that people share in terms of their essential human values, if you want? And I think that is where this is really important, this debate, because I would suggest if you had focus groups or sessions in Devizes and in the middle of Dagenham on the Becontree estate, you would find very similar views about people's desire for a sense of community, of contribution, of a sense of fraternity, of a sense of a social contract in their own minds, less codified by the council or the state, but their desire for a clearer sense of covenant that is beyond transactional. It's beyond an instrumental transaction between fellow citizens. And I'm sure this would be a very interesting project to do, actually, that there would be similar outcomes in Devizes and Dagenham, probably very at different ends of the usual sort of political spectrums. That's why this debate is very interesting in terms of spaces for political reconciliation or moving beyond these binaries that disfigure modern politics. Across Western market economies, this is not, look what's happening in inauguration tomorrow and look at the climate within which that's operating. Can you create different political metrics? And that's why I think this is quite profound, this sort of space. Now, it does leave, obviously, the case of what next? Well, I would suggest in every local community, I know we have a thing called Community Solutions in the council. We have a thing called Participatory City, which is fantastic. We have B&D Collective, which is trying to collaborate, which is trying to create new forms of community power. We've got new attempts to permanently endow the community by the council and create new independent forms of charitable status to endow local community projects. In every community, there will be good, positive examples consistent with some of the ideas in this report. The question is of sort of creating some sort of space where we share best practice. Onward is really doing a lot of good work there. I mean, obviously, you've got your second year work program to be developing, James, about whether you're going to pick local spaces or pick local examples of innovation that can be shared, best practice. I mean, it is about sharing a practice in all of this, and does link into new forms of leadership and sharing different forms of innovation and leadership within our community. So there is a space for sharing ideas and best practice here as we go forward.
Yeah, thanks, John. I mean, we're listening to you, I'm just sort of reminded, is it that Churchill quote, we shape our institutions and they shape us? And actually, some of the more enduring interventions, at least in the public's mind, have been those with a very clear institutional framework. So I think of something like Sure Start centres. People have, there's been a decline in them, as we know, in the last 10 years, but people spontaneously mentioned them. They were, a physical manifestation of
just on that, James. Sure Start didn't fall out of the sky. It was built around post-war attachment theory and the operationalization of certain developments in social psychology and the social sciences into public policy making in the early Blair years. It went the wrong way eventually, but it was a really interesting alignment between some of the thinking behind community in the academies and some of the most innovative public practices and how we create those coalitions in the future. And that's what I think Onward is trying to do for the next phase of this.
Exactly. And I would add free schools into, I think, because again, they sort of fit that kind of framework about institutions that people can identify with certain characteristics. And I guess one of our challenges is how to create more of those kind of institutions that will actually deliver this kind of agenda. Danny, I don't know if you wanted to come in on this or wait for the next questions.
I'll just be very, very quick. I mean, I agree with those things, and we're basically talking about capital, and I agree we need buildings and things, assets, people can coalesce around and habit, sort of gathering places. But we also need, revenue. And so I'll answer Cassie's question. The two big things I would do, one is very kind of granular, but massive, which is commissioning, procurement reform, which is underway, and quietly, it's not getting many headlines, but Theo Agnew in the Cabinet Office is reforming the way the government spends the £300 billion a year it spends on services, and to ensure that SMEs, social enterprises, local organisations of all sorts can be in line for commissioning, and so the whole kind of social value agenda, which was started 10 years ago, I think is potentially absolutely transformative. I mean, that's the big one in a sense. That's the biggest expense that we make as a country, is the government buying stuff. Well, what's those budgets for? How do they strengthen communities? They don't at the moment, but they could. They don't enough. And then the other one is, again, I rip off all my ideas from other people. And this again comes from Adam Lent at New Local, the Community Power Act, to put it, and it refers to the point that Tom Chance makes there, which is about basically giving communities the right to demand. I'm not too much talking about land purchase, although I'm very interested in community land trusts, but in the sort of right to deliver public services. It's the community should be empowered to demand a say in the way services are delivered, and potentially a role in delivery themselves. So we need a radical transformation in public services, and I think we can do that through a declaratory piece of legislation that puts that power into communities' hands.
Great, thanks, Danny. Now I'm going to try and get a couple more rounds of questions in. So just very quickly, Adam's asked about the role of heritage and history. I think we've touched on that a bit. So Adam, if you don't mind, I'm going to move on to a couple of the other questions. Firstly, about what's the role of local government? Is it an enabler, or is it a barrier to further devolution and decentralisation of power? And then I really would like you both to reflect on questions from Charles Rigby and Raj Patel, which seem to me to some degree connected. The first is, young people. Trust is declining. It layers on the other structural challenges which they face. How do we turn this into an agenda which has meaning and purpose for younger generations? And what is the role of social media and digital in that? Is it can it be a force for good, or is it essentially destructive to these kind of to building trust in local areas. So some really, really important and rich themes that it would be great to hear from you both on. And I might come to you first because you mentioned digital. And as I say, if you could also talk about the sort of young people's aspect of it as well, that'd be great.
Did you say me? Okay. Well, I mean, I think there is the digital dimension is enormous. The opportunity here. I mean, civil society is sort of the great laggard in digital uptake, and that means there's a very low-hanging fruit here. You know, if we could properly digitize data and measure impact and improve access and record keeping and so on, in civil society, we could radically improve its effectiveness and I think help capitalize it and get cash in as well. So I'm having a whole bunch of conversations with tech firms and big tech firms and small ones about how the role they could play in building that better. And I think it's potentially, very significant. On young people and on social media, I mean, I'm mostly it's bad. In terms of we've moved from one problem to another. 20 years ago, we were all worrying about antisocial behavior, teenage pregnancy, alcohol and drugs, and all of those indicators have now declined because the youth are, sitting in their bedrooms, not fighting and shagging anymore. They're all getting mentally unwell and depressed and bullying online. So I'm not sure. There are definitely massive problems. We need to regulate the internet. We need to get on. It needs to be part of the commons, not the Wild West. And there needs to be cultural barriers around internet use and how children engage with it. But for all that, as I say, the opportunities to use tech and use digital to connect civil society and obviously to create opportunities for young people are absolutely immense. And it's the world we're in, and we can make great value from it. And Charlie and I are in touch. Charles Rigby and I are in touch about this. I mean, I think there's a huge opportunity to deliver a really effective youth offer that is digitally enabled, but is about enhancing face-to-face common activity on the model of the National Citizen Service, using the Kickstart scheme that this government's introduced. I think we could do some really great things for the young people who are, of course, the great victims of the current crisis.
Yeah, and thanks, Danny. And our year to serve idea is very much in that spirit, and it's it's urgent, obviously, because this isn't just a structural problem; it's a problem right now for millions of young people. John, I guess your patch has a younger age profile than Danny's. If I'm jumping to a subject here, but how do you engage young people in this endeavour?
Well, we actually, it goes to the question about what is the role of the local state here, enabler or inhibitor? And actually, over the last few years, it's been a real enabler locally. For example, they put up the money to build the first youth zone in London, which has been an outstanding success. Obviously, it's been slightly more challenging than the pandemic, but those sort of interventions of ensuring that we can attract more private finance. We're in conversation with people like Barry Hearn to develop some new initiatives around youth employment programs linked into patterns of volunteering. So, the local state is a real creator of an enabler of different opportunities to get it right. The tech thing links into that, obviously. I was in conversations yesterday with Avril McIntyre from B&D Collaborate, who was key in terms of trying to build new platforms to passport all generations through the systems locally, both in terms of new safety nets, in terms of food substance, white goods, children's clothes, all that sort of stuff, but also through the jungle of benefits and entitlements, and the new knowledge base, so people can link in and create pro bono advice through welfare rights, immigration rights, partly through the social capital in the churches as well, all linked in through new sort of technological passports for young and old. And that's got to be the sort of future to that. Linked in, I think the final point is, and I take the point about the new commons around technological platforms, is how, as I say, we have these 9 new hubs. How do you create almost de facto new parishes, or even they become parishes? It goes back to the first question that was raised. How do you give genuine power here? Because it still is prone to quite paternalistic forms of administration within the council. So we need to just take this further down the road. And obviously this all links into year 2 of Onwards programme, I guess, in terms of you've got the 17 policy ideas. Part of this is to flesh out what can work, try and test them in local communities, try and get some new advocates and supporters to make them real propositions and embed them within the government and hopefully the opposition policy programme as well.
Thanks, John. So I'm going to have to give apologies to lots of people who have asked fantastic questions, Chris, Lynn, Michael, and others. But I'm going to pick on an anonymous attendee. It's unfortunate name, but has asked the most provocative question on the list, and I think it does get to the heart of why this is so difficult in politics. So this is an opportunity, John and Danny, to give your kind of last word. And apologies to others, Susanna and Laurie and so on, that we haven't got time to get to. But it's asking why it's been so difficult for politics, for mainstream political parties to prioritise a proactive family policy. We've talked a lot about community, we've talked about local government, we've talked about local institutions, but at the heart of our analysis is the idea that the first institution of society is the family, and they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. But the idea behind our family tax allowance is that even though because they come in all shapes and sizes, they also need extra financial support than they currently get. And that actually is a better use of money than a marriage tax allowance. But it is controversial. It's evoked quite strong responses from people. Why is it difficult for political parties to talk about families in this country? It's not so difficult in other countries, but why do we find it so hard? And how do we get over it? John, Danny, this is your last word as well. So any other points that you want to raise?
Great questions and comments. Loads here. I do feel there's a sort of tribe building that is forming this sort of radical consensus around the sort of society we want, which is brilliant. A sort of policy is sort of catching up with where I think the public is. The family question, you're right, it does go to the heart of things. I mean, my answer for why it's so difficult and why it hasn't happened. We domesticated the household through industrialization. The oikos, the economic unit of the household, was sidelined, and it became a purely domestic sphere in the late 19th century through to the 1950s, 60s, and it became a sort of sacred place where the state should not tread and have no particular role, nor did the market have much of a role in it. It was sustained by a single wage earner. When that model ended in the 60s through deindustrialization and second wave feminism, the home was sort of, as it were, abandoned, and both parents were out working, and again, that the home wasn't a place for politics. And so for different reasons, both left and right, one thinks it's sacred, and the other, I'm afraid, thinks it's somewhat irrelevant. Particularly traditional families, it's very difficult for politicians to tread into this space, but it is actually what people actually care about, what we all talk about: love and sex. What else is there? This is the stuff of life, and it's the stuff of culture. And someone said all politics is a bigger house and garden. Ultimately, this is what people are voting on. So we should be thinking about the economy of households once again. And I think your proposal is absolutely outstanding. It'll take us some courage to get there, I think, because of all the implications. But yes, this is the new space. And just again on the political consensus, I give great credit to Keir Starmer for talking about families, first Labour leader to do so for a long time. I think he's still talking about them in quite a sort of instrumental way, and not talking about family formation and relationships, but still to talk about families is a good thing. And my party as well, we have a family champion in cabinet. Treasury thinking hard about family finances as well, but it does need to enter our political culture a bit more, I agree.
Yeah. Thanks, Danny. John?
Well, you're not going to get me disagreeing with a lot of that. I also welcome Keir Starmer's interventions in this. Obviously, families come in all shapes and sizes. I remember once I was pulling together a Labour manifesto, and a senior member of our shadow cabinet went through it and removed the word family from it every time it appeared, which I thought was quite a startling thing to do, given the fact that it's probably the word that people are most attached to in their everyday lives, is the terms of family. So for a political party to remove that reference to it in its proposition opposition to the country probably offers diminishing returns electorally, as well as it's not necessarily the right thing to do. I always thought I come from a very big, wide, extended Irish Catholic immigrant family, and family acted against the dispossessions of the modern world, be they in terms of economically and socially or whatever. So it's a key building block to build a more civilized society, whilst acknowledging the variety of forms it comes in. It's not a form of imprisonment or an inhibitor of self-realization. On the contrary, it facilitates our ability to live the lives we wish to rather than we have to, given the modern world, which goes us right back to the terms of this debate in and around onward. So the family has to be the core building block for a modern politics. It's so self-evident, it's almost painful to say.
Thank you, John. I can't put it better than that. Well, look, I want to draw things to a close now. Apologies to everyone who didn't get their questions answered, but hopefully you have found a huge amount to think about and muse on as a consequence of the discussion that we have had. I want to express my sincere thanks to John and to Danny for, as ever, very thoughtful and provocative contributions today, and for their work on this programme. To also express my thanks to Will, Fiola and the team at Onward for their work on the project, and of course our sponsors, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Shelter, Power to Change and others, and thank you all for participating in this. As John said, we are halfway through a 2-year programme, and I think we've done good work so far, but there's even better work to come, and that work is going to be about taking these policies and turning them into concrete, practical and doable ideas that appeal across the political spectrum. And it is going to be about working, I hope, in some specific places to actually turn these into action, not waiting for other people to do them, but actually working with local people to make them happen. Building at the end of the year towards a major conference when I hope we will all be allowed to meet in person. What a joy that will be. And proposals for a new social contract and social covenant so that we can rebuild our society and make sure that everyone has a positive role to play in it. So thank you again to everybody. It's been a pleasure to spend time with you. I hope you have a good day and please stay in touch. Thanks, bye.